Hello and welcome to Dialogue. During the three-day New Year break, over 52 million domestic trips were made in China, a year-on-year increase of 0.44%. Overseas traveling is also expected to boom as quarantines on international travelers will be suspended from January 8th. What kind of impact can we expect on the tourism industry after restrictions are lifted? What has been the international response to China's reopening? And what more do we know about the new variants from the US which are sweeping the globe? To find out, I'm joined in the first half by James Liang, co-founder of Trip.com Group. And for the second half, I will be joined by Chheang Vannarith, president of Asian Vision Institute, and Professor Gong from the University of International Business and Economics. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qingduo. Welcome to the show, James. China's tourism sector has been grappling with the impacts of COVID-19 for roughly 3 years now. With the recent announcement that China is easing COVID controls, we are expecting to see a surge in passenger and traffic flow, in particular for the upcoming Spring Festival, the biggest festival for the Chinese. As an insider of the tourism industry, what's your take on how China's tourism industry will recover this year? I mean, can we sure that there will be a recovery, whether it will be quick or it will take some time?
Well, yeah, we are very optimistic about the travel industry overall in China. As we know that as people getting infected, but usually they will quickly recover after a week or two. Definitely will recover after a month. So a month from now, probably most people already have recovered, and then people will start looking to travel. And I think overall domestic travel is probably going to recover first because people wanted to travel internationally. They've been stayed home for the last 3 years, but it takes some time for the international flights to recover. So flights initially will be much cheaper domestically than internationally. So I think domestic travel, short-haul travels will recover first. But after probably 6 months, the later half of the year, I think the overall travel, including both domestic and international travel, will recover fully the second half of the year.
Mm-hmm. Then the question is, people will ask, how will traveling in the post-pandemic era be different, or if there is any difference from what we have experienced over the past 3 years?
Yeah, based on our experience, we have a very big business outside of China as well. I mean, other markets have recovered first. Based on our observation, and the global leisure market actually will be recovering or growing faster than the business travel because people have more flexibility post-pandemic. A lot of people have been working from home during the pandemic, but even after the pandemic, a lot of people continue to have a flexible working system. They can work 3 days at home, 2 days in office, a kind of hybrid working scheme. We offer, Trip.com, our employees also have the flexibility to work 3 days from home or 2 days from home in China and globally. So a lot of companies are adopting a flexible working schedule. That means people have more flexibility. They will have longer vacation and they will have longer flexible time to travel in a long distance. Mm-hmm. So we'll see a more demand in the leisure travel, but less demand for the business travel. And the business travel will probably conducted by Zoom, some of them. But there will be more team building and conference and events. So the big group travel and event-based oriented travel and big conferences will be very robust. And the leisure travel, as I mentioned, yeah.
Yeah. Well, there are some differences, obviously. You have been exploring the global tourism market in recent years. How is the global tourism doing right now, given most restrictions around the world have been lifted already?
Oh, I think the domestic travel was fully recovered. If you look at the US, the domestic travel is actually more than the 2019 level, and especially when some of the international travel were replaced. because international flights are still not yet fully recovered and very expensive too. So most people, alternatively, they will travel domestically. So domestic travel, for example, in the U.S. is more than recovered. And regional travel, if you consider Europe as one country, intra-European travel has more than recovered. I think China domestic travel is probably very likely to have a very good year, starting very quickly. But I think overall international travel, it still takes some time to recover, especially Chinese tourists. A big part of the whole global international travel is still missing. But I think gradually, starting first quarter and then in the second half of the year, the global travel, international travel will recover very soon.
Second half of the year. There's a term that people call it revenge travel. Basically, people try to make up for the lost time over the past 3 years. But at the same time, there are issues. For example, in the US and other countries, you do see hotels, motels, and airlines are struggling to operate at full capacity because employment in these sectors stands at just, for example, less than or at 83% of February 2020 levels. Will we similar revenge travel? Of course, you told us yes, but then what about the Chinese tourism industry? Are they prepared for such a travel surge?
Yeah, I think different markets or different countries have different employment market situations. In the U.S., as we know, they have a inflation situation. They have a very tight market, tight labor market. So travel industry is competing with other industries for labor. I think in China is quite different. We are not in the inflation situation, and the overall demand is weak. Overall employment market is actually relatively weak. I think the hotels and airlines should be able to hire enough workers to meet the demand for the travel industry. Some of the international flights operated by foreign airlines will take some time to recover, but I think the domestic hotels, domestic airlines, and Chinese airlines will be able to recover pretty soon. So I think the mismatch of the demand and supply will be less of a problem in China.
James, there's a question, lingering on the minds of many travelers. Probably, we know some countries have imposed restrictions. For example, you need to show a negative test before you enter the country. Could such requirements affect the arrival of Chinese tourists, to deter their enthusiasm to travel overseas?
Well, actually, the requirement compared to what we had before is relatively light. You're talking about just taking a PCR test, 48 hours rather than a mandatory quarantine. So that's a much light restriction. And also, there's only a few countries that have restrictions. There's still lots of countries, particularly in Asia. For example, Singapore, Middle East, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Middle East, and Southeast Asian countries like Thailand still have no restrictions. And also, I think even those countries have restrictions will be very short. For example, I think they're talking about lifting the restrictions within a month or two, because as we know, the peak will go away very quickly, and China, the infection rate will come down very quickly. So I think the restrictions is, first of all, very light, and also will go away very quickly. And there's still a lot of countries that Chinese tourists can travel without any restriction, and also visa-free. A lot of countries are really taking this opportunity to claim and making an announcement that they have no restrictions for Chinese tourists. So they're very keen on attracting Chinese tourists. So there's still a lot of international destinations that Chinese tourists can choose from.
So still a lot to look forward to. Thank you, James Liang, co-founder of Trip.com Group. Thank you for sharing your insights with us. And next, we will have a closer look at the response to the Chinese reopening. And we will have Chheang Vannarith, president of Asian Vision Institute, and also Gong from University of International Business and Economics. Welcome to the show. Speak of the response, to the Chinese reopening. Of course, we talk about, some countries imposing additional restrictions. At the same time, we do have countries like New Zealand. They are taking a different approach. New Zealand's COVID-19 official said that, visitors from China will not contribute significantly to the number of cases in the country, which means entry restrictions aren't required or justified. John, I will start with you. Why are we seeing these different responses to the Chinese reopening here?
Well, first of all, let me say that there should be a scientific basis for imposing such restrictions. I think, from China's perspective, our argument is based on the fact that the virus that is currently spreading out in China is a incumbent existent virus that has already been infecting these countries. So the likelihood of further increasing their country's infection rate is marginal in my view. So I think that's the reason why we've been arguing that seems like these restrictions are unnecessary. Having said that, however, I can understand why these countries are imposing these restrictions. I can understand that where they're coming from. They probably emphasize reciprocity, or they even think that even a marginal increase of infection brought by potential Chinese travelers is still very a serious matter. These things I can totally agree and I can totally understand. Now the issue is that what is the official excuse or the official reason cited for imposing these restrictions? And I can comment on Washington's policy. Washington's official stance is that it is based on lack of adequate data and lack of transparency.
Speak of that, John.
I have a problem with
John,
that.
Speak of that. Let's take a look at the response from the Chinese side. As you said, the U.S. CDC quoted a lack of transparency from China, quote unquote, regarding the data about the new infections in the country, and has announced that the Chinese travelers, they need to show a negative 48-hour COVID-19 test before entering the country. China's National Health Commission spokesperson reiterated China's willingness to share infection data, and China has been cooperating with the WHO since outbreak 3 years ago. Let's take a look.
Currently, the global criteria for determining COVID-19 deaths is mainly divided into two categories. The first is when a patient dies of respiratory failure who tested positive for COVID-19. The second is the standard of all infectious diseases, according to the World Health Organization, which says that if death occurs within 28 days after infection, it is recorded as a result of COVID-19. For example, if one infected person dies in a car accident or commits suicide, the death is still recorded as the result of COVID-19. Since 2020, China has always adopted the first category of death criteria. China has always adhered to the principle of seeking truth from facts, openness, and transparency in disclosing information about death and severe cases. If a person has tested positive for COVID-19 and death of respiratory failure caused by COVID, it will be reported as such.
John, why don't you continue with your understanding of the classification? This is a part of the reason the U.S. has been accusing the Chinese side of lack of transparency. Is about the classification of death in terms of COVID here.
Right. Well, there are two issues here. One is with respect to the number of cases. And I think we all know this. I mean, it's spreading like crazy in China. It's totally a moot point of continuing to monitor and collect very accurate data about the infections and these things. And many countries have already stopped doing this, treat this as if it's just a regular flu. So, the inadequate data, speaking of inadequate data, I mean, there's a question about whether there's a need for adequate data, right? So I think if if the United States and many other countries are stopping collecting these data, there's no need to talk about these things anymore. That's the first thing. Regarding the classification of death due to die off or die of COVID or die with COVID. What's the distinction between these things? Here's my position. Okay, I think first of all, this is very much a scientific question, and for some cases we probably would never be able to know the ultimate cause because people die from a combination of reasons, and it's just like somebody died from lung cancer. What is smoking? How much of a role smoking has played, right? So it's a very difficult issue here, and I think the 28 rule is probably a empirically valid means of attributing what's called the underlying cause of the death to COVID. So this is very much a medical matter. Now, I think we don't have to be arguing about what is the most accurate, the most important, the most credible way of deriving statistics from these deaths. And I think this is a totally moot point. And why can't we have multiple statistics measurements? And we don't have to have only one statistic method, right? And also more important, I think, at this time of the COVID development, is it so much important to argue about these things? I think it's becoming, an issue going away. I think COVID is going away, and this whole debate about these issues is probably should, in my view, go away accordingly. So, so I think at this point, China, the issue about reporting these issues to the United States. My understanding is that it's actually reported that I think someday towards the end of December, China did a very detailed briefing to the WHO. And I think there got to be a mechanism in place where other countries can get information from this this mechanism. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me that United States. Of course, United States is a very important market for Chinese tourists, and also it's very important from a trade and investment perspective, but that doesn't mean that the United States should be treated very differently, that the CDC in China has the obligation to provide a one-on-one briefing, particularly to the CDC in the United States. I mean, this is something that they can discuss, and they can, if there's a need, they do that. If there's no need, I don't think Beijing is obligated to report to the CDC in Atlanta, right? So, this total acquisition that the lack of adequate and transparent data from China doesn't seem to be holding water to me.
Chheang, from Cambodia, we know that if you look at Asian countries, in particular Southeast Asian countries, very few of them, except Malaysia, has some restriction. The rest of the group, no, they made no actual conditions on the arrival of Chinese tourists. What do you make of this response? We are seeing basically mixed response. Some countries embracing the arrival of the Chinese tourists, others imposing additional restrictions.
Well, Southeast Asian country in general are warmly welcome Chinese tourists, the arrival of Chinese tourists. First, the tourism industry is instrumental in social economic recovery in the post-COVID-19. And Chinese tourists rank the top among international tourist arrival to Southeast Asian countries. So economic reasons, economic interest. Second, Southeast Asian country also have political trust in China. So they believe that the Chinese government have made a very cautious, very careful adjustment to the COVID-19. So this kind of trust also matters, political trust. And since the beginning, since day one, Southeast Asian country always trust and support the Chinese government in handling the COVID-19. But of course, as we all know, unfortunately, there's a high politicization of the COVID-19 since the start. If some country did not politicize COVID-19, perhaps we better cope with the COVID-19. But unfortunately, now once again, we feel this kind of a repeat of what happened at the early stage when the COVID-19 spread in Wuhan province. So I don't think the politicization of this kind would have in terms of economic recovery and international cooperation.
You mentioned about politicization of this COVID-19. I mean, particularly at the beginning. I mean, for our viewers, if they recall how the Trump government politicized this COVID-19 by calling the virus China virus at the beginning. Of course, now if you single out the Chinese travelers, I mean, it's natural the Chinese side will be sensitive to the act from Washington, right?
Yes, because they still remember what they were treated in the early stage. But calling Wuhan virus or China's virus, it's purely a political agenda.
Exactly. John, President Biden of the U.S. Also joined this debate. He said he's worried about the way China is handling the pandemic or the reopening. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure he knows what's really happening in China. And I think secondly, it's probably a kind of a cheap political stab, political shot, to maybe catering to the his constituency base. I think there's no basis for another country to be criticizing China for kind of a very severe situation right now, even though it's coming back much faster and much better than we expect. I think the United States government, the United States president, if he can really help, want to contribute to successfully containing this thing here in China, I would call on the U.S. government, particularly Pfizer, for example, that's one great American company, to make donations of Paxlovid to China. And I think this saves lives, saves a lot of people's lives. We are in a vast need of some good medicines. Thank goodness some American companies, they have invented these very good medicines. And this is time to put them to use. And I think people in China will remember that, and Chinese government will remember that. Now, let me also point out that the height of the American COVID development in earlier, March and April in 2020, in 2020, I think there are companies and also Chinese government, people in China also donated a lot of equipment, PPPs and other equipment, masks to American people. As a matter of fact, I myself published an article in a Chinese newspaper here in China called Global Times, advocating precisely this point, that we should help the Americans, that we should donate things to help them. Now we are in need of these things, and it's for them to step up and help us. So I think this is not a time to criticize, to point fingers and to make a political point on this. This is time to save life. American life and Chinese life are as precious as everyone else on the earth, and it's time for the American government to take some actions.
Chheang, if you take a closer look at the response with the restrictions, the IATA, the International Air Transport Association, which represents about 300 airlines, they made a statement saying that several countries are introducing COVID-19 testing and other measures for travelers from China, even though the virus is already circulating widely within their borders. It is extremely disappointing to see this knee-jerk reinstatement of measures that have proven ineffective over the past 3 years. So I think they have a point, right? If you look at the past 3 years, whether when there's a new variant, some countries probably they want to suspend flights or close their borders. But ultimately, I mean, the virus knows no borders, and they will be spread in different parts of the world.
Well, learning from the Southeast Asian experience, before opening up, we understood that travel restriction did not work because the virus already within the country, and the most effective way is to control within the country, right? Those kind of measures. So that is something that we learned, and now I think some countries impose this kind of restriction on Chinese traveler. I mean, or those traveler from China. It's not fair. I think it's more of a misperception or political kind of manipulation of the issue. So that is something we need to make decisions based on the facts on the grounds and look at the science and use the science to inform us when we make these kind of decisions.
Well, John, look forward, for example. I mean, there will be a new variant. Right now, in China, we are seeing the circulation of BA.5, BA.7, for example, in Shanghai or Beijing. Well, these are the strains that has been circulating around the world in different countries. But now we are seeing, for example, new strain, XBB or XBB.1.5. One epidemiologist, Eric Ding, from the US, he said this is the new strain is responsible for the sudden surge of COVID-19 cases in the US. 42% of the infections in that country comes from the new strain, which is likely an American-originated recombination variant. Well, it doesn't matter, right, where it is from, because ultimately it will be found out in other parts of the world. And the WHO reported like already 29 countries and regions have discovered that this new strain. Right. But what's the right response probably? If we look at the future response or response, say, for other countries, there's a new variant, it will arrive inside our borders.
Right. Yeah. So so it's already reported that this new variant is already arriving in China. And my response to that is, even though I'm not an expert, a medical expert, epidemic expert in this area, and I think based on my limited reading of this matter, my understanding is that these variants are spreading very fast, but not going to be as lethal as the previous variant. So it's the viciousness of this virus is actually waning. So if that's the case, I think a correct response would be based on science, and based on medicine. This is it's 100% a medical issue. It's 100% public health issue. So we should adopt a strategy, adopt a policy based on scientific analysis of these things, and based on my limited understanding of this, it's not going to be as lethal as it used to be. So I think all these this calls for restrictive measures, tit for tat responses, are totally uncalled for in my view. Both sides should sit down and talk about it. Both experts on both sides should talk about it, and develop a common strategy. China and the United States are the two most important economies in the world, and both scientists on both sides should come together and talk about these things and develop a common strategy towards that. I think the last thing we want to see is politicizing these issues from their own country's perspective. That's not the way to handle this matter.
Chheang, actually probably this is the right time for countries to work together jointly, dealing with this new variant or upcoming variant probably, because we have chosen to live along with the virus, and they are getting largely less and less lethal. It's really about how to get along with that and find the final solution probably.
Right. I think a blame game has always been a big mistake, a serious mistake since day one in the fight against the COVID-19. So we need to learn, over the past 3 years, we have been struggling together to fight against the pandemic. So don't waste time or lose time in this kind of political debates of this kind of a new variant, travel restriction. We need more than ever international cooperation to address not only the public health issue, but other global issues, because we are so much interconnected and interdependent. So we need to change our whole mindset and by working together. I'm afraid to say that some countries, they still pursue this kind of very narrow national interests and selfish interests. So
cooperation
that is very dangerous.
Is the way forward. Well, with that, we come to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Chheang Vannarith. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.